Welcome to the Thomistic Institute podcast. Our mission is to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university, the church, and the wider public square. The lectures on this podcast are organized by university students at Thomistic Institute chapters around the world. To learn more and to attend these events, visit us at Thomisticinstitute.org.
Thank you all so much. Thanks especially to the chapter here for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your patience as I navigated Dallas traffic from the airport. Can beauty save the world? You might think the answer should be yes, given something Pope Benedict XVI said. Art and the saints, he claimed, are the greatest apologetics for our faith. Since the poet makes beautiful things, and the saint has a beautiful soul, perhaps we should conclude that poets and saints should be peopling the Marvel cinematic universe, rather than, well, all those other so-called superheroes. On the other hand, perhaps some of you had an experience like this one. You find yourself in a magnificent and beautiful church, let's say the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome. Have any of you been there by any chance? It has a Caravaggio painting in it, a painting of the Calling of St. Matthew. And some of you might know that painting. It's famous for Christ's extending his hand in imitation of God the Father's hand in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. It's a beautiful painting. At any time of day in that church, you will find crowds of people in front of the painting. And few people, and sometimes no people, in front of the Blessed Sacrament. That is the work of a poet. The beautiful thing, the beautiful painting, seems like an obstacle to the beautiful saintly soul. So are beautiful and salvation partners, or are they rivals? And this evening I'd like to think a little bit about Pope Benedict's claim on behalf of art and the saints, and how beauty might contribute to world salvation. We could begin thinking about the importance of beauty in many ways, and I'd like to start with the theory of the transcendentals developed by the medieval scholastics. How many of you have heard of the transcendentals? All right, good. The rest of you, I apologize for beginning with some heady metaphysics. I promise before the end, I'm going to shift gears and tell you a story before I reach the end of my remarks. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, there are certain universal characteristics of all things that exist, simply insofar as they exist. These characteristics do not add anything to the existence of something, the way we would say that standing up here in front of all of you adds something to me. Yesterday I wasn't here, but now I am. Instead, as Aquinas says, some predicates may be said to add to being inasmuch as they express a mode of being, not expressed by the term just being or existing itself. Some of these predicates are common to all beings insofar as they're beings. Things like thing. Everything is a thing. Everything is a being. Everything is one in some sense. But some things name aspects of being insofar as they're related or something else, have a connection to some other thing. These attributes of being reveal a very deep connection between different existing things. And the two attributes that Aquinas discusses most famously are goodness and truth. Good, he says, expresses the correspondence of being to the appetite, to what we desire. For as we note in the Ethics, and here he's referring to Aristotle, the good is that which all things desire. And true, he says, on the other hand, expresses the correspondence of something to the knowing power. For all knowing is produced by an assimilation, a taking in of the knower to the thing known. So that assimilation is said to be the cause of knowledge. The upshot of all this is that for Aquinas, all things, insofar as they exist, are good. Evil, according to this way of thinking, is not anything really existing. It's an absence of something that should exist. And all things insofar as they exist are true. Ultimately, all things that exist correspond at least to the mind of God. I haven't yet mentioned beauty, for the simple reason that Aquinas didn't include beauty in his list of transcendentals. In fact, no medieval list of transcendentals includes beauty. I've often wondered how Aquinas' thought might have changed in this regard had he read more Plato. Though he knew Aristotle's texts backwards and forwards, there was very little of Plato's writings available when he was alive. And of course, beauty has a special place in Plato's thought. Plato isn't substantially recovered in the West until the Renaissance. And it's during the Renaissance that the trinity of truth, beauty, and goodness becomes a commonplace. It wasn't until the early 20th century and the work of the Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. How many of you have heard of Jacques Maritain? Okay. In fact, no medieval list of transcendentals includes beauty. It wasn't until the early 20th century, Jacques Maritain, that beauty was systematically developed as a member of the scholastic transcendentals. Maritain's book, Art and Scholasticism, published in 1920, was extraordinarily influential in this regard. It was the book, for example, that the Catholic novelist and short story writer Flannery O'Connor famously said she cut her aesthetic teeth on. Maritain surrounded himself for much of his life with artists, writers, poets, sculptors, and others devoted to the life of beauty. And he gave them, in his slim book, a way to connect their lives to the highest levels of mystical reality. Maritain begins by reminding us that Aquinas defined beauty as that which pleases when seen. As Maritain says, these 4 words, id quod visum placet, 4 words in Latin, these 4 words say all that is necessary, a vision, that is to say, an intuitive knowledge, and a joy. The beautiful is what gives joy. Not all joy, but joy in knowledge. Not the joy peculiar to the act of knowing, but a joy superabounding and overflowing from such an act because of the thing known. If a thing exalts and delights the soul by the bare fact of its being given to the intuition of the soul, it is good to apprehend. It's beautiful. Beauty, therefore, according to Maritain, is the transcendental that combines goodness and truth. That which is good is desirable, it pleases us, and that which is true is apprehended by us in a vision that corresponds to reality. The beautiful is therefore the pleasing goodness of a reality made known to us. If Maritain's right that beauty is a transcendental, and I confess, I at least for one am convinced, then beauty most properly belongs to the metaphysical order, and ultimately it names God himself, just as God is truth and goodness. So he is also beauty. Reflecting on this, Maritain quoted a passage from the 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire. It is that immortal instinct for the beautiful which makes us consider the world and its pageants as a glimpse of, a correspondence with heaven. The insatiable thirst for everything beyond which life reveals is the liveliest proof of our immortality. It is at once by poetry and through poetry, by music and through music, that the soul perceives what splendors shine behind the tomb. And when an exquisite poem brings tears to the eyes, such tears do not argue an excess of enjoyment, but rather attest an irritation of melancholy, some peremptory need of the nerves, a nature exiled in the imperfect, which would fain possess immediately, even on this earth, a paradise revealed. Beauty, for philosophers like Maritain, poets like Baudelaire, delights us, draws us in, and pulls us up out of our everyday lives and into the realm of the eternal. But so does goodness, and so does truth. That's what it means, after all, to be a transcendental that picks out relations between existing things. And there is, I think, more than a hint of rivalry here between these three. After all, what life would be best for you? The life of the mystic in pursuit of the truth, the life of the poet in search of beauty, or the life of the saint in search of goodness? Here's one form of this potential rivalry. There is an ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy, Plato wrote in his Republic. For such expressions, he says, as the bitch yelping at its master and howling and great in the empty eloquence of fools and controlled by a mob of the omniwise, That's probably my favorite. And the subtle thinkers who are beggars all, and countless others, are signs of this old opposition. Plato has Socrates banish the poets from his ideal city, since if they're allowed in, pleasure and pain will be kings in our city, instead of law, and the thing that has always been generally believed to be best, reason. In turn, by the time Plato wrote in the 4th century before Christ, Socrates himself had already been the comic butt of Greece's most famous funny man, Aristophanes. In Plato's Apology, Socrates describes Aristophanes as one of his old accusers, partly responsible for his execution, a fact Socrates alludes to again in the Republic in the allegory of the cave, when he suggests that philosophers will first be mocked and then killed. We have 11 plays, comic plays, by Aristophanes, and though Socrates in philosophy appear in a number of them, he's the star of the show, so to speak, in the third, The Clouds, probably performed first in 423 BC, 24 years before Socrates' trial and execution. In The Clouds, Socrates appears as a priest of subtlest hogwash, who robs and corrupts his students before being burned to death on the top of his thinkery, set alight by a disgruntled father whose son returned home having learned only how to argue in defense of beating up his own parents. One important question at the center of this rivalry between poetry and philosophy, or we might say between the pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of truth, is this: what gives us human beings the best insight into what is most real? On the one hand, perhaps rational reflection expressed most fully in the purity of the life of wisdom. Maybe that's what yields the most satisfying results. On the other hand, perhaps artistic sensitivity, the kind of awareness experienced by Dante, Jane Austen, or J.R.R. Tolkien, allows us to see most deeply into the life of things. Our desire for a connection with what is most real, as the heart of a life well lived, is an important part of Plato's Republic, where Socrates argues that the poet is 3 times removed from reality. The philosopher is involved with what is most real, the ideal forms of things, like beauty itself. The artisan with those material objects that are in second place, like a beautiful piece of furniture. And the artist or poet with what is least real, a poem or a story about real material objects that are themselves copies of the ideals. This problem is likewise on Aristophanes' mind, and his caricature of Socrates is a familiar one. Socrates is interested in irrelevant minutiae far removed from the real business of human life. And if he were really honest with himself, he would see that his intellectual posturing is just a mask for the private pursuit of personal gain. What's so great about the ivory tower? 3 months off each summer. Plato, who presented so beautifully for us so many important human questions, gives the love of beauty, on the other hand, a special place in our lives. According to Socrates in a different book, The Symposium, it's by means of the love of beautiful things that we eventually ascend to beauty itself, what will become God for Christianity. But each of us also in turn yearns to give birth in the beautiful, as he says, meaning that we long to unite with what is beautiful and bring forth fruit from our union. Lovers have children, and philosophers and poets write books or teach students. This means we face a choice. Should we aim for the contemplative rest we might find in the beautiful itself, or should we seek to create our own beautiful things? This is a slightly different form of rivalry. You could say one question is whether when we enter that church in Rome, should we spend time with Caravaggio's painting instead of in front of the Blessed Sacrament? But it's another question whether Caravaggio himself should have bothered painting the painting in the first place, rather than devoting his time to prayer. At times, this rivalry has been expressed by the divide between the active life and the contemplative life. Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her. So said Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, when Martha complained that her sister Mary wanted simply to sit at the Lord's feet, rather than help with the tasks of hosting. That image of the contemplative life as superior to the active life has worked its way into much of the Christian intellectual tradition. Isn't it better to gaze on the face of Christ than to paint a picture of it or write a play? How can we think of artists as achieving anything better than second best? Or again, picking up on the way that Plato's thoughts in the Symposium are reflected in the development of the Christian tradition, isn't religious life better than married life? Better is it not to marry God, join oneself to the beautiful, than to marry someone else and give to birth to one's own fairly diminished beautiful things. I have 5 cute, beautiful things of my own, but they are not godlike. They're approaching, but they fall short. Plato had no problem with the shadows in the cave. They are necessary, like beautiful people and works of poetry, but they are to be transcended. Their means only towards something greater, and blessed are they who can turn from the shadows to real things, and finally to the real source of all. Now, I think the writer J.R.R. Tolkien, and I hope more of you have heard of him than the other ones I've mentioned, can help us think about this problem in some provocative and helpful ways. Tolkien was inspired, as a scholar and as an artist, by the sagas and myths of the old Northern Europeans. The body of literature written down in Old Norse or Old Icelandic, or the same language, in the 13th and the 14th centuries, is a remarkable collection of mythological poetry, legends, intensely passionate and personal human stories of achievement and suffering. The poetic Edda and the prose Edda describe the creation of the world and the growth of the world tree, the birth of dwarves, elves, giants, and the gods, Odin, Thor, and Loki, among many others. Back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'm afraid. The sagas, most famously of all Njál's saga and the saga of the Volsungs, tell family stories of farm life, marriages and wars, blood feuds, and revenge. They give us a world at once both violent and deeply human. And Njál's saga, by the way, made a deep impression on the Norwegian Catholic writer Sigrid Undset, which perhaps not as many of you have heard of. When she was a child, she read Njál's saga. It captivated her. And her Nobel Prize for Literature of the 1920s was based principally on her 2 long historical novels, Kristin Lavransdatter and Olav Audensen, sometimes called the Master of Hesviken. She's a different version of appropriation of Norse mythology and Norse saga literature, and a very different appropriation. In order to return to the problem I'm interested in, the rivalry between wisdom and beauty and goodness, and whether or not beauty can save the world, I want to consider 2 short works by Tolkien, each written while he was in the midst of writing The Lord of the Rings. His short story, Leaf by Niggle. How many of you have read Leaf by Niggle? All right, I'm going to spoil it for you this evening, but I'd like you should go back and read the whole thing sometime soon. Niggle, as in a niggler. He's always doing little things. His short story, Leaf by Niggle, and his essay on fairy stories, written about the same time while he's halfway through, more or less, The Lord of the Rings. Each in its own way is a consideration of The Lord of the Rings and also a consideration of his own activity as a literary artist. In On Fairy Stories, 1939 Andrew Lang lecture that he gave at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, Tolkien tried to explain what he himself aimed at in his fiction. Fairy, he said, the realm or state in which fairies have their being, contains many things besides elves and fays or fairies, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm, or upon its shadowy marches. The perilous realm is not exactly earth, though it must involve people, and so Tolkien rules outside of fairyland all travel tales like Gulliver's Journey to Lilliput, or dream tales like Lewis Carroll's Alice stories, and beast fables like Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. Fairy begins, he says, in what we would now call fantasy, where the author becomes a kind of creator, a sub-creator. This aspect of mythology, he says, sub-creation, rather than either representation or symbolic interpretation of the beauties and terrors of the world, is, I think, too little considered. Sub-creation in fairy stories is, says Tolkien, plainly, not primarily concerned with possibility, but with desirability. If these stories awaken desire, satisfying it while often whetting it unbearably, they succeed. The land of Merlin and Arthur was better, here he's speaking of his own childhood, than the wilderness of bows and arrows. I'm sorry to say that in Texas, but that's what he said. And best of all, the nameless north of Sigurd of the Volsungs, and the prince of all dragons. Such lands were preeminently desirable. The dragon had the trademark of fairy written plain upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was an other world. Fantasy, the making or glimpsing of other worlds, was the heart of the desire of fairy. The world that contained even the imagination of the dragon Fafnir was richer and more beautiful, at whatever cost of peril. The dweller in the quiet and fertile plains may hear of the tormented hills and the unharvested sea and long for them in his heart. Even more for Tolkien, that the images of fantastic subcreation are of things not in the primary world, if that indeed is possible, is a virtue, that they're imaginary. It's a virtue, not a vice. Fantasy in this sense is, I think, not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved, the most potent. So, last passage from Tolkien. Finally, to the elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires. And when it is successful, of all forms of human art most nearly approaches. At the heart of many man-made stories of the elves lies, open or concealed, pure or alloyed, the desire for living, sub-creative art. That was a lot of passages from Tolkien. We could spend a long time considering what he has to say about fairy stories as he describes them. What's most important for me this evening is his description of his craft as sub-creation. This was surely on Tolkien's mind when he wrote, just a few years later, 1942, the short story Leaf by Niggle. I'm going to retell this story for you now, all too briefly. For those of you who have heard it, I'm doing an injustice by shortening it, and for those who haven't, I'm doing an injustice by spoiling it, but nevertheless, I'm going to tell it to you anyway. Niggle is a little man who had a long journey to make. But he did not want to go, and he put off his preparations. He was also a painter, though not a very good one. One picture in particular eventually captured all his attention. It had begun with a leaf caught in the wind, and it became a tree, then all round the tree and behind it, through the gaps in the leaves and boughs, a country began to open out. And there were glimpses of a forest marching over the land, and of mountains tipped with snow. Niggle lost interest in his other pictures, and his canvas for this picture grew so that he needed a ladder to reach the top portions. When neighbors called, he was polite, but underneath he was always thinking of his painting. As time went on, his garden became neglected, and Niggle's time became even more precious as his troublesome journey grew closer. One day his neighbor Parrish knocked and begged Niggle to go to town for the doctor for his sick wife, he himself being unable to go because of his lame leg. Niggle went, cursing under his breath, and fetched the doctor in the middle of a storm. Parrish's wife, of course, turned out not sick at all. Parrish and his wife were accustomed to ask many favors of Niggle for the sake of their own convenience. But Niggle caught a terrible cold and hadn't yet recovered before the driver came to take him on his long-awaited journey. After some years in the hospital, where he was made to do various jobs, and which he eventually did very well, he was sent away to a new place in the country. And upon arrival he fell off his bicycle, for before him stood the tree, his tree, finished. If you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind that Niggle had so often felt or guessed and had so often failed to catch with his paintbrush. He gazed at the tree, and slowly he lifted his arms and opened them wide. "It's a gift," he said. He was referring to his art and also to the results, but he was using the word quite literally. After some time, improving the land about his living tree, Parrish himself joins him. "Niggle's picture," says Parrish in astonishment. "Did you think of all this, Niggle? I never knew you were so clever. Why didn't you tell me?" Another man says, "He tried to tell you long ago, but you would not look. He had only got canvas and paint in those days, and you wanted to mend your roof with them. This is what you and your wife used to call Niggle's nonsense, or that daubing." "But it did not look like this then, not real," said Parrish. "No, it was only a glimpse then," said the man. "But you might have caught the glimpse if you had ever thought it worthwhile to try." And then Niggle departs, leaving his tree for the mountains. He was going to learn about sheep, the story continues, and the high pasturages, and look at a wider sky, and walk ever further and further towards the mountains, always uphill. Even little Niggle in his old home could glimpse the mountains far away, and they got into the borders of his picture. But what they are really like, and what lies beyond them, only those can say who have climbed them. Some time later, there is a conversation held about Niggle's country. "It's proving very useful indeed as a holiday, and a refreshment. It is splendid for convalescents. And not only for that, for many it is the best introduction to the mountains. It works wonders in some cases. I'm sending more and more there, and they seldom have to come back." I hope the theme of subcreation is clear enough in this story. Niggle's painting of the tree is in a way Tolkien's own mythological world, of which The Lord of the Rings is only a small part. And by inventing his tree and his country, Niggle continues in his own way the divine creative activity of God himself. What makes this story so thoughtful, though, is the way Niggle's painting is taken up into eternity. I can't help but assume that Niggle's journey is his death, and his long work in the hospital afterwards a kind of purgatory. His time then in the countryside, in the company of his completed and living tree, is curious. I myself think it is the beginning of heaven, the foothills, so to speak, before the divinity proper of the mountains. Tolkien, I think, is suggesting that the artist, the sub-creator, is adding to creation, and as such is contributing to heaven itself. I said earlier that the mystic, the poet, and the saint represent most fully the three rival lives that we heirs to Western intellectual history seem forced to decide between, and that reflect the three most important transcendental qualities of truth, beauty, and goodness. Leaf by Niggle is an extraordinary attempt to hold together all three lives and all three transcendentals. Niggle is an artist whose art is mysteriously connected to contemplation, and his active moral life, all the little thankless favors he does for Parrish and his wife, for example, is taken up into the story. Niggle sees after his death that some of the most beautiful leaves of his tree were produced with Parrish's help. His own artistic accomplishment, though he could not see it at the time, is itself inextricably intertwined with his morally virtuous actions. On the other hand, as a sub-creator of a part of heaven, Niggle fashions the very things that will be contemplated by himself and others. He is adding to what we can know and experience, and in this way leading both an active life and a contemplative one. His life is active because it involves genuine making, and the making of things really new and experientially powerful. But since he is a sub-creator, and not a creator, he must first draw on creation in order to fashion his own works. And when he's done, what he has made is taken back up into the created order, added to the firmament of heaven, as part of the cosmos, and they're a fitting object of wonder. But this taking up and completing of his work is not something he himself can do. Tolkien, like Aquinas, will find his own work completed in heaven, reflected in the mind of God. Perhaps then, if Tolkien is right, when we see God face to face, in him we will also see, miracle of miracles, Tolkien's own stories. Gandalf, Frodo, Bilbo, and all the rest, perfected and completed in a way that Tolkien himself could never have imagined. And those of you who never see St. Matthew's painting will see it one day. Tolkien doesn't exactly do away with the perils of beauty. Instead, it seems to me that he emphasizes through Niggle's story that God has decreed that we will find him only by means of created things, things beautiful and good in themselves, and worthy of being appreciated in themselves, even if they are also the means by which we will come to our God. Even more, once we do come to him, we are still meant to love and treasure those other created things. I suppose you could say God commanded Caravaggio to paint as well as to pray, because painting is good. It is a form of union with God, not by looking at him, but by creating like him. It is a form of imitation. And God commands us to look at Caravaggio's paintings, partly because that's how we will be drawn to God, but even more so because those paintings are worthy of being looked at in themselves. And God commands that we look at created things and not just at himself. Along with the transcendentals, Jacques Maritain was also fond of what St. Thomas Aquinas called connatural knowledge. Knowledge that he considered non-conceptual, deeper in various ways than discursive knowing and reasoning. Such connatural knowledge, wrote Maritain, appears before us under three distinct forms. Practical knowledge, which judges matters moral and the subject itself. Poetic knowledge, in which subjectivity and the things of this world are known together in creative intuition. And mystical knowledge, which is not directed towards the subject but towards things divine, and does not of itself issue in anything made, but in which God is known by union and by love. Let the mystic reflect an instant upon himself, and a St. Teresa or a St. John of the Cross will show us to what extent the divine light gives him an inexhaustible knowledge of himself. Maritain's reference at the end to St. Teresa of Avila is appropriate. Tolkien's story about Niggle suggests that we need wisdom and poetry and sanctity as partners in order to see into the life of things. Likewise, the contemplative stance and the active stance, both in its creative form and in its holy form, its saintly form, are, so I think, both necessary in a life well lived. If we were to use Maritain's vocabulary, we'd say that each of his three forms of connatural knowledge are interrelated and interdependent, and the best of lives is a combination of all three, and such an imitation of God himself. St. Teresa, at the very end of her masterpiece, The Interior Castle, written in the late 1500s, just a few years before her death, concludes that Mary and Martha are not two different forms of life, but instead two different aspects of every well-lived life. Believe me, she says, both Martha and Mary must entertain our Lord and keep him as their guest, nor must they be so inhospitable as to offer him no food. You may offer an objection that I said that Mary had chosen the better part, but she'd already done Martha's work by waiting on our Lord, by washing his feet and by wiping them with her hair. And then what terrible pain his absence must have caused her during the long years after his crucifixion. You see, she was not always enjoying contemplation at the feet of our Savior. Mary, in the eyes of St. Teresa, lives an active life as well as a contemplative one. And rather than expressing rival forms of human life, the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness should be internalized within each person. St. Teresa does not explicitly consider the creative life, But I can't help but think she'd be sympathetic to Tolkien's suggestive claims in Leaf by Niggle. And if Tolkien is right, part of her joy in heaven comes from the pleasures of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Can beauty save the world? Well, in all honesty, it already has. For if beauty is a transcendental, then God is beauty itself, as well as truth and goodness, and his Son has indeed saved us. And he offers to each of us access to himself through what is true, beautiful, and good. Pope Benedict leaves us with one final question, though. Why does he speak only of art and the saints, and not the mystics, or contemplatives, or philosophers? I don't think we should be surprised if, as Pope Benedict suggested, art and the saints are the greatest apologetics for the faith. If the three deepest experiences of human knowing are mystical, moral, and poetic, then while mystical knowledge remains in the soul, tending towards silence, and terminating in an enjoyment of the absolute, as Maritain once wrote, moral knowledge expresses itself in a life, and poetic knowledge in a work, things that others can reach out and touch, and through them find their way back to the mysterious source of that knowledge, and then back out again to the created world. Goodness and beauty provide us in a special way access to the world of the transcendentals, and so to God. And beauty, as the transcendental that holds together truth and goodness, in a way holds an even more precious place in our hearts than goodness. Not because beauty is more important, but because beauty awakens desire, as Tolkien says. It makes us long for things that we only dimly perceive and have not yet begun to strive for. Each of us begins our return to our Creator as true and as good with an experience of beauty. And each of us must try in return to show that beauty to others. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Thomistic Institute podcast. The generosity of people like you makes this podcast possible. If you enjoy these talks, please consider showing your support at www.thomisticinstitute.org/donate. Your donation of even $1 helps us reach more college students and many others with the powerful truths of the faith, and it ensures that we can keep publishing top-notch lectures on this podcast. Thanks a lot.